Okay, welcome to today's webinar. These webinars are sponsored by HMIPA, CAOT BC, and the BC Care Providers. Our three organizations work together to encourage relevant education for our members. Today's presentation is called Quantum Power Base Overview, Navigating Front, Mid, and Rear-Wheel Drive Configurations. The presentation has been put together by Sydney Herring, who works with Pride Mobility. And Sydney's a kinesiology grad from Simon Fraser University, started his year as a rehab specialist at Motion Specialties. In 2008, he moved to area manager role with Pride and Quantum Rehab. And he's currently the senior area manager for Western Canada, responsible for education and account management throughout BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. When not bombarding people about the finer points of power wheelchairs, Sydney likes golf, hike, and hang out with his wife and dog. With this presentation, if you've got questions or want to comment, there's a chat thing on Zoom, and I'm presuming that at this point in our lives, many of us have spent, feels like, a good part of the last 18 months on Zoom rather than live interactions with people. So you can either raise your hand. I've got somebody raised, oh no, that's me. Either raise your hand or you can send a chat, and Sydney and I will both see that. Following this presentation, we are recording it, and following the presentation, the full presentation will be posted on the public pages of the HMIPA website, so anybody can view it there. It'll be there so that if somebody wants to review or to go back and check it out later, then that's not a problem. Finally, thanks to you all for joining us, and especially thanks for Sydney for putting it together. And over to you, Sydney.
All right, thanks guys. Good afternoon. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. I'm super excited to present to you something that I'm fairly passionate about, and it is not only just power bases, but we're really going to focus on drive wheel configuration and how it affects the end user. And not only that, how to actually pick what type of drive wheel configuration is going to work best for your end user. So we're going to spend a lot of time kind of navigating through that. And as well, yes, I work for Pride Mobility. Yes, many of my examples are going to be Quantum Rehab examples. So we're going to spend time looking at the Quantum Rehab examples of each of these drive wheel configurations, but you should be able to use this information and apply it generally throughout, throughout your day, or, All right, next. So let's start with the learning objectives here. So for the learning objectives today, we want to be able to identify each different drive wheel configuration. We're going to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each configuration. And at the end of each configuration that we discuss, we're going to look at specific Quantum Rehab examples in each of these categories to help really tie it all together. So this is the first of two concepts I want to talk about before we really get into the nitty-gritty here. So here I want to go over something called the turning circle, or a turning radius. So it's something that I want you to keep in mind throughout the whole presentation, because we're going to keep coming back to it and discuss it when we look at each individual type of chair. So in front of us, you see a rear wheel drive, or a depiction of a rear wheel drive, a mid wheel drive, and on your very right, you're going to see the front wheel drive. So what I really want you to look at is take special notice on how each individual base achieves a turn. One isn't better than the other, but how they achieve turns are going to be very different. If we look at the middle of our screen, we see the mid-wheel drive, and typically that always has the smallest turning radius. I'm sure you've all heard that. I'm sure you know that. But if you look at the rear wheel drive and the front wheel drive, a lot of the time the turning radius or the turning circle is similar, but that doesn't tell us the whole story. How they achieve that turn can be very different. And it's what we're going to go into later on in the presentation. But really, generally speaking, the rear wheel drive turns at the axis of turning, which is the back wheels, and it has a lot of front end swing, while the front wheel drive does the exact opposite. Since the drive wheels are at the front, your axis of turning is right at the front of the chair, And of course, you have a lot of rear wheel swing or rear caster swing when you're doing a front wheel drive. Again, we're gonna discuss that in more detail here. Now, the other concept I want to really talk about here and spend a couple minutes here is center of gravity. So center of gravity is that imaginary point in any body of matter where the total weight of the body is thought to be concentrated. It's an imaginary idea. It's trying to figure out where most of the weight is in a client. And some things to keep in mind is center of gravity is not a set measurement. Unfortunately, we have to eyeball it a little bit. 2, everyone has different anthropometry. So everyone really exhibits a different center of gravity. And then 3, well, I guess this is kind of the same thing, but 3, the adjustments can vary by client. So we're going to talk more when we talk about the different configurations and how to set them up. And actually, I believe that's the next slide anyway. But how it is when we have someone, let's say, carrying a lot of weight forward, sometimes a front wheel drive is a better option for you. So let's discuss that. Okay. The next part here. So I'm just going to give you all the information. Beautiful. Okay. Position of the client's weight. So this is still our center of gravity discussion here. So in this slide, we have depictions of 3 different types of wheel configurations: the mid-wheel drive, the front wheel drive, and the rear wheel drive. For the best drive performance and durability of the product, this is kind of what I would suggest in all of these different drive profiles. For the mid-wheel drive, I always try to set the majority of mass, the center of gravity, over top of the drive wheel. Now, in this case, it always will, for a mid-wheel drive that is, this will always give you the best stability and best traction of the unit by putting the majority of the weight over the drive wheel. It pushes those drive wheels into the ground so that it gets good purchase of it gets good purchase of those tires into the ground to make sure that it's propelling us over top of our obstacles. For front wheel drives, we typically want to set the majority of the weight just behind the drive wheel. Now, the example that you see here, I'm going to grab my laser pen here. There we go. Hopefully you can see that as well. Now, if you see the normal force or the gravitational force here, I have it on this chair called a forefront. I have it just behind the front wheel, but right where the suspension meets, okay? So right in the middle of the suspension. This again is going to give us the most stability and the best traction of that unit. Okay. The last one we're going to talk about is the rear wheel drive. That's this guy over all the way to the right. The rear wheel drive, we want to set the center of mass or the center of gravity just in front of the rear drive wheel. So on this chair here called Quantum Rival, it is set right over top of the motor. So just in front of that drive wheel and just over top, or just in front of the drive wheel and just over top of that motor. What we get here is the majority of that weight over top of the suspension, which is being covered by the aero, but over top of the suspension to give us the best ride quality. But again, it's going to give us the best stability and it's going to give us good traction. If we set this client too far forward, we're going to put too much weight on that front caster. And when we put too much weight on that front caster, the chair doesn't drive the way you expect it to drive. It makes it difficult for those front casters to turn in and out or to make turns. So it ends up taking a lot of energy to actually turn this chair. And that's when you create a very whippy front end chair. Okay? So hopefully that all makes sense. Over the mid-wheel drive, over top of the drive wheels, in a front wheel drive, just behind the drive wheels, and in a rear wheel drive, just in front of the drive wheels. Now, it should be noted here, most companies, and of course, Pride/Quantum, you have the ability to slide these seats fore and aft, so we can change where that center of gravity is for a client. Okay. We're going to move on to the next slide. In the beginning, there was really only rear wheel drive. the industry started with the E&J rear wheel drives back in the 70s, actually, and they're still great chairs. There are clients that love rear wheel drives. It was around the 90s we moved into front wheel drive with the Jazzy offerings. And that actually is Pride as well. This was before the Quantum Rehab division was put together in the early 2000s. And then from there, this industry has really become dominated with the mid-wheel drive. The mid-wheel drive, of course, drive wheels in the middle, 2 front casters, 2 rear casters, giving us a 6-wheel system. All right, so what are the advantages of mid-wheel drive? All right, so remember back to the turning circles that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation? I'm sure you do. Mid-wheel drives have the tightest turning radius, leading them to be some of the best indoor driving chairs. I'm sure this is something you have all heard many, many times. They tend, there we go. They tend to climb reasonably well. They always have 6 wheels on the ground. So that 6-wheel configuration allows these bases to be very, very stable. They tend to always have good traction, not great, but good traction on most surfaces. They're typically the most intuitive for new users to drive. I want to spend a second on this because hopefully this will make sense. When we place the client's center of gravity over top of the drive wheel, when that chair turns, it turns reasonably close to where the client's hip turns. I find for a lot of new users, and this is, I know, a little bit anecdotal, but for a lot of new users, that ends up being very intuitive, very easy for the client. When that center of mass is not quite over top of the drive wheels, that's when we start to get either front end swing or rear end swing, and that makes it more difficult, typically for end users to learn how to drive that chair. I guess this last point here is very similar. I mean, it typically, much like the more intuitive, there's less cognitive demand to judge for these turns, meaning that there's not as much front end swing or as much rear end swing in these chairs. Okay, so now that we know the advantages of the mid-wheel drive, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of the rear-wheel drives. Now, I think the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things I think about with mid-wheel drives is that the front casters, these front casters that you see in the picture here, they sometimes get in the way of transfers. And there's not a whole lot you can do about that. And that can be a big disadvantage for mid-wheel drives. Those same front casters can be problematic for those with long legs and have tight hamstrings. Those with long legs, well, let's use the tight hamstring example. Those with tight hamstrings need to have their front riggings close to 90 degrees. And sometimes that can interfere with these front casters here. Now, although there's been real vast improvement in the drivability of mid-wheel drives, they can still high center over obstacles. And they're really limited to what obstacles they can climb. And that limitation has to do with that front caster again. How far this lifts up the ground is going to dictate, it's going to be your rate determining step of what you can actually climb over. So really, really important to know that although there's been huge advancements in mid-wheel drive through all the manufacturers, they're still never going to climb as well as a rear-wheel drive or a front-wheel drive. Now, due to the front end suspension, some mid-wheel drives can give the sense of pitching forward. I want you to take a look at this picture again, and you notice those springs there. Those springs provide a lot of the suspension that you get out of mid-wheel drive. In most mid-wheel drives are built similarly. There's always springs at the front, sometimes at the back, to help give you suspension. What it's doing, it is, oh my goodness, can't talk today. It is suspending the front casters and the rear casters to help really reduce some of that vibration dose. But because of that, because of this movement, up and down movement in the front caster, sometimes you can get a little bit of pitching forward that can be a little disconcerting for some of our clients. And lastly, mid-wheel drives are just not as good as front or rear wheel drives for attenuating shock. And the real reason behind this is that 6 wheels on the ground, as opposed to 4 wheels on the ground that you see in front and rear wheel drives, they create more points of contact. And just because of those more points of contact, and this is without looking at the suspension at all, but because of the extra points of contact, the 33% more contact on the ground, we're going to create more vibration dose, no matter what suspension you have on there. I want you to think of it this way. When you're riding over top of a sidewalk, and you know those sidewalk junctions in between each kind of brick of sidewalk or each concrete slab of sidewalk, you have those concrete junctions. And when you go over top of it, you have 3 sets of wheels, 1, 2, 3, the front, the mid, and the back, that's going to go over top of those obstacles. When you have 6 of them, or when you have 3 sets, you're gonna have more vibration no matter what you do. And then the last thing, and this has to do with suspension as well, is typically this mid wheel is not suspended. Sure, a lot of times they're air filled, but they're not actually suspended. So the client's riding right over top of it. It ends up being a harder ride than looking at front wheel drive or rear wheel drive. Okay. So let's look at a few examples and of some quantum bases. So the most basic rehab quantum base that we do is something called a Q4. A lot of times this is termed our basic medical necessity base that we offer. But a few things I want you to notice. There's still a very good base in terms of its overall suspension. You can see those 2 big springs there that are suspending the front casters. They're always going to be a pretty small chair, generally speaking. They're only 24 inches in width, 35.5 inches in length, with a 20-inch turning radius. So really, this is what the most basic one that we do, but this is what a lot of our other bases are built off of. And so let's take a look at some of the other offerings. The next offering up in the quantum lineup is something called the Q6 Edge 2.0, which is really built off of the same frame as the Q4 and really has the same front end suspension as a Q4, so rides quite similarly. But it adds some extra ability, like the ability to put something we call eye level on our chairs, which is the elevation product that we use. It uses a slightly different motor, which is a Linux 2-pole motor with a worm drive. It's a little bit different, but what it does is it has a little bit less what I like to call wheel slop in the wheels. So it ends up being a little bit more intuitive to drive because there's less lag in the system. So it ends up being a very good chair in terms of how smooth it drives because of just the new motor or the type of motor that we put on there. The next chair in the lineup is called the Edge 3. So just to give you a bit of chronology between those 3, the Q4 originally was called the Q6 Edge. That came out in 2008. The Edge 2.0 was was started to be built in 2012, and the Edge 3 is 2016. So you notice that we kind of have this 4 or 5 year gap between all of our chairs in terms of when we come out with new features or when we actually create a new chair. But notice how we still have all 3 of them. So it ends up being a nice little price point jump between the 3 so that you can see the differences between those 3. Now the Edge 3 is built off of the exact same chassis as the Edge 2.0, but the key difference here is I want you to look at this front end suspension. Notice how it's not just a big gray spring. This time we have a gold shock with a black spring over top of it. So this chair uses an automotive grade nitrogen charged oil based shock. A lot of words. I don't expect you to know the difference, or I don't expect you to remember all that. But what I do want you to know is between an Edge 3 and an Edge 2 or a Q4 for that matter, that suspension actually is a lot smoother. And our own in-house testing is we found that we get 36% less vibration dose amplitude. What it means is we just get quite a bit less vibration. And the reasoning behind that is when this is compressed, when this spring and this shock system is compressed, it releases back down to the ground in a much slower, more controlled manner. It doesn't just chatter along those sidewalk junctions, much like you see with like a Q4 or an Edge 2. Now, the last mid-wheel drive I'm going to talk about is actually relatively new. And the fun fact of the day is the name of this chair, the Stretto. The Stretto is Italian for narrow. So when you looked at those first few chairs that I talked about, they were all still quite narrow compared to a lot of chairs in this industry at around 24 inches in width. Well, this one's a little bit different. This one is squished really, really narrow, and it's only 21.75 inches in width. That's a huge difference. Now that's with the 14x3 wheels, the regular wheels that you see on power chairs. But there's a second wheel package with a smaller wheel, a 12.5x2 inch, which actually gets this width to 20.75 inches in width. Again, that is huge. That is much, much more narrow compared to the Q4, Edge 2, or Edge 3 that we were just discussing there. Now, the one thing I'd say about this chair is there's a point where a client becomes too wide for it. I want you to think of a client that's maybe 19 inches, has a 19-inch hip width or a 20-inch hip width. At that point, they're already as wide as the chair, if not wider, if you think of where their arms are going to be sitting. At that point, I don't see a big advantage. You've taken away the real advantage of this chair. So where I like to pigeonhole this chair is for pediatrics and smaller adults. Now, I want you to notice that it also has a very similar suspension to the Edge 3, where we actually have those gas charged shocks to give us a very, very smooth ride. So it's very similar to the Edge 3, but just think of it this way, squished more width-wise to create a much smaller chair for a lot of our clients, which is quite nice. All right. So we've done the mid-wheel drives. It's great. I think we understand them fairly well. We see them all the time. But what about some of the other drive wheel configurations? Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the rear wheel drive. All right. Just gonna bring up all the points and then talk to them all. Ooh. All right. Now, the rear wheel drive. These are some of the most stable bases that are on the market. And typically, they're very, very easy to control at high speeds because of how stable they are. They tend to track very, very well, and they always want to move in a straight line. This is what I tell a lot of the reps and therapists that I work with, is that rear wheel drives are great for clients who want to drive in straight lines for long distances. They work incredibly well in those cases. Typically, these bases will have a softer ride than mid-wheel drives. And this is really due to having a four-wheel configuration versus a six-wheel configuration. I know we already touched on this, but I think it's worth investigating one more time. When you have four wheels on the ground, you only have two sets of wheels that are actually hitting each different obstacle. So already you have 33%, without looking at the suspension, you have 33% less vibration opportunity than you would with a six-wheel system. Rear wheel drives also handle aggressive terrain very, very well, and they transition over obstacles with relative ease. And part of the reason behind that is you have a really big front caster here. Now on this example, this is a 9-inch caster, but different chairs will have different options for you, including this one here. And actually, you can do an 8-inch caster, a 9-inch caster, or a 10-inch caster. Because of those big front casters, it can really get over top of obstacles without any real trouble. And the last one, this is just, again, anecdotal, but I just find this really to be the case. Many users that start in a rear wheel drive just don't want to get out of rear wheel drive. And I get why. They're very stable. They typically drive they have very good traction when it comes to speed. They climb very, very well. They get over obstacles very, very well. And when someone starts with one and can understand how those chairs drive, they typically never want to get out of it. Again, anecdotal, but it's just something that I see. All right. Sorry, guys. All right, so let's talk about some of the disadvantages of rear-wheel drive. Rear-wheel drives, they're bases that can be difficult to maneuver in tight spots. I want you to think back to that turning circle slide near the front of the presentation. They have a pretty large turning radius, and they tend to have a lot of front end swing. Rear-wheel drives are going to turn at its axis of turning, which is behind the user typically. Remember, we're trying to set the user up just in front of that rear drive wheel over top of that spring to give us the best traction, to give us the best suspension. But because of that, the actual axis of turning is behind the client, and it ends up having a lot of front end swing. These front casters swing sometimes pretty hard for the client to the right and to the left. And not everyone can get used to that. There can be access issues sometimes with rear wheel drives as well. We talked about it with mid wheel drive and the front casters, but because those front casters are so big, sometimes we have some access issues with those front casters as well. So sometimes some transfers can be difficult if those big front casters get in the way. Then the last point I'm going to talk about is rear wheel drives can be challenging and less intuitive for new users. We gave the positive or the advantage to the rear wheel drive as saying that clients that started with it really love it and they typically stay with it. Again, anecdotal evidence there. But I find with brand new users, sometimes it can be challenging, especially in those indoor environments, because of how they turn, how they move, and how big that turning radius is. So I guess the takeaway I want you to take from this is that they are the better chair for outside environments, but they can really struggle in inside environments, especially ones that are very, very tight, small apartments, let's say. Okay, so we only have one rear wheel drive. So the example I'm going to use is something called the Quantum Rival. Kind of what we were talking about before, this chair really does give exceptional outdoor performance. It has less vibration and can climb incredibly well. Since they're pretty simple in terms of the suspension, we just have one spring, and I'm going to show you in the next slide here. We just have one spring that acts underneath the user. Even though this is a pretty non-complicated suspension, it ends up being a much smoother ride than any of our mid-wheel drive offerings. So it is something to note. All right, so we're now on to our last drive wheel configuration. And this is the front wheel drive, and sometimes maybe the least understood drive wheel configuration that I work with. So just going to give you all the points and then I'll talk to them here. All right, so what are the front wheel drive advantages? Front wheel drives can make some of the tightest turns around corners. So unlike rear wheel drives, this front drive wheel is right, or I kind of just said it. This drive wheel's right at the front of the chair. Now, the front of the chair ends up being the axis of turn. So we can make very, very tight turns with a front wheel drive. I want you to think of going down a hallway and having to turn into a doorway. Front wheel drives, since their drive wheel's right at the front, we can actually start that turn and create a very sharp angle turn with a front wheel drive. The thing, of course, to be mindful of, which we'll talk about in the disadvantages, is that there's a lot of back-end swing. But if you have the room, front wheel drives actually make the sharpest turns, sharper than a mid-wheel drive. Front wheel drives also tend to climb obstacles very, very well. And this is due to the fact that the front wheel drive configuration is typically the first to hit the obstacle. What I mean by that is when you're traversing over top of these obstacles, it's the big wheel that hits first. And when the big wheel hits first, it hits that obstacle and it has so much surface that it can get over top of bigger obstacles and it pulls you over top of that obstacle. So it ends up being a very good outdoor chair because of that. Really, really cool. The front wheel drives also work very well for those with tight hamstrings because it allows the lower body positioning to be very close to the actual chair itself. So what I mean by that is in terms of transfers, even with those small anti-tips there, in terms of standing pivot transfers, I find front wheel drives can be the easiest to access or the easiest to transfer into. So I think it's a point that that is, very, very pertinent. And the last point I'm going to talk about is front wheel drives work very, very well for those that carry their mass forward. I didn't put it in our slides because I didn't want to confuse the issue here, that we do have some bariatric chairs, and some of the best bariatric chairs I find actually end up being front wheel drives, especially those who carry their mass forward. Why that is and when you carry your mass forward, you can sit the client pretty far back into the chair, but their center of mass is still just behind that drive wheel, and it allows you to get very, very good traction. Now, I said that was the last, but I got one more point there. It's at the very bottom. Front wheel drives are a very soft riding chair, much like the rear wheel drive. And I know this seems like I'm just repeating the same things as the rear wheel drive, but it is the same concept. Front wheel drives have 4 wheels on the ground. They only have 2 sets of wheels that are hitting each obstacle. And without even talking about all the fun suspension that you can get in different brands of mid-wheel drives, they only have those 2 sets of wheels. So again, that's 33% less contact than you're going to find with a mid-wheel drive. So you're always going to get less vibration in a front wheel drive than you do in a mid-wheel drive. All right, much like every drive wheel configuration, front wheel drives has its own fun sets of disadvantages. All right, front wheel drives typically have a little bit less traction going uphill. There's a reason for this. Now, we're gonna have to imagine this a little bit, but this is my handy dandy laser pointer, so hopefully this can actually help here. So on a front wheel drive, when you're going uphill, when this chair is traversing uphill, our center of mass is not working as the normal force, much like it does with just straight gravity in a flat surface. When you're going uphill, the center of mass is going now diagonally backward. We're taking some of that center of mass and we're putting it further and further back on the chair. So they actually don't go up hills as well as either a rear wheel drive or a front wheel or a mid wheel drive. They just don't. Now, turning can be tricky for new users as well. Let me explain. So turning in one of these chairs for new users, let's use that example, is the new user needs to be able to understand that there is much more chair behind them. I know we can create that sharper turns. We already discussed that. You can create nice sharp turns, but there's so much rear end swing that you can get in a front wheel drive. So if the client isn't cognitive of what is behind them, that can create a bit of a difficulty, especially for new users. And lastly, this is probably the least understood part about front wheel drives. And if you've worked with them, you probably already know this. But no matter what brand of front wheel drive there is, you always need to have an extra set of electronics in that chair. If a front wheel drive, a Rehab front wheel drive is worth its weight in salt, it needs to have these extra electronics. And different companies do different things. Maybe they use gyroscopes, maybe they use accelerometers, maybe they use Hall effect sensors, but they all do the same thing. Front wheel drives always want that back end to turn out from them. They always want to make turns. These things that we put into the chair, the extra electronics, they help the chair track straight, okay? So whether it's a gyroscope, an accelerometer, or a Hall effect sensor, it's usually mounted at the back of the chair and it understands where that chair is in space, so that when you give it a forward command, it doesn't try to actually have that rear end swing up. Because of the extra electronics that you need to put into a front wheel drive to make it drive the way you want it to drive, they tend to be the most expensive chair on the market. All right, so let's go over our front wheel drive offering, which is called the Forefront 2. Now, the Forefront is really our only front wheel drive offering in the sub 300-pound weight capacity market. We have something else called a Q1450, just more for your notes. The Q1450 is our bariatric chair that has a 600-pound weight capacity. Now, this chair also, it doesn't show really well in this picture, but this also incorporates what we call our SRS suspension. Do you remember back to the Edge 3? This is the coil over nitrogen charged shock that we talked about with the Edge 3. This shock, again, does a better job of releasing, or just smoothly releasing its spring, so that you don't get as much of a jarring effect. You don't get as much vibration. And this ends up being the smoothest riding chair that we have, which is really, really quite nice. It also incorporates something that we call STC. Remember when we were talking about the extra electronics just a slide ago? That's the extra electronics in a quantum chair. STC is Smart Traction Control. Smart Traction Control is our gyroscope that we mount near the rear of the chair underneath the shroud so you can't see it. And the gyroscope constantly sends feedback back to the electronics, which we call QLogic 3, and it makes sure that that chair is in the right spot when you're driving forward or when you're making a turn, so that it ends up being very seamless, so you don't have as much of that back end swing. The idea is so that the chair is tracking as intended. The other thing to really know about this chair is they tend to be a little bit longer. Again, this talks a little bit to the turning radius and the back end swing, but there's one other thing that I think is very, very useful in a front wheel drive, is that even though they're not really any wider than the typical mid-wheel drive, they have more space for us to put batteries in. Because there's more space for batteries, we have more real estate for the batteries, we can put a bigger battery into it. And I want you to think, and I know we haven't talked about batteries, but all I want you to remember from this is that the bigger the battery, the bigger the gas tank. Because of that, you typically end up getting better ranges out of a front wheel drive. You can put a bigger battery into it, so you get better ranges, which creates a better outdoor performing chair, in my humble opinion. All right. So that's it, guys. Hopefully I've discussed the differences between the front wheel drive, the mid wheel drive, and the rear wheel drive in a good, satisfactory way. And hopefully, for those especially who haven't really explored the different configurations, hopefully that really allows you to help with the decisions that you make with your end user, to really give them those positives and negatives for each different drive wheel configuration. So at this point, what I wanted to do is really open it up to you guys, just to fire off any sort of questions that you want, either via the chat box, or you can certainly unmute yourself as well. And you can unmute yourself as well, and you can certainly ask your questions that way.
I've got, it's Phil. I've got a thing I wondered if you might address.
Yes.
You've done a good job of talking about all the pros and cons of the various options. Could you just take a minute and say, what would be the first chair you'd try if you were dealing with a 12-year-old child with cerebral palsy, an active adult who takes a SkyTrain to work, and someone who's fairly heavy set, someone who's over, close to 250?
Okay, perfect.
What would be your first pick to say, let's try this with each of those three? I think that'll help us to
Absolutely. So
work out where to go.
first, how I'll address that question is 80%, and this is probably the same for the other manufacturers as well, but 80% of the quantum chairs that we sell are mid-wheel drives, okay? And it's not a bad place to start with everybody. It really isn't. It's when the mid-wheel drive doesn't address the needs of the client that it might be a good idea to start looking at some other ones. And hopefully we demystified some of the rear wheel drives and the front wheel drives, the advantages of them. But let's start with the 12-year-old with CP. I would probably start again with a mid-wheel drive like I always do. Now, depending on the size of the client, the one from the Quantum lineup that I really like is that Strato, just because of the overall width of the client. It really allows for a lot of different access in very small spaces. In my experience, there's been times where sometimes that's the only chair that will actually get into a bathroom for a particular client, or the only chair that will get beside their bed, which is really quite nice. So that can be a very good option for them. When we're price challenged, though, the Q4 is always going to be an excellent option for them to try. Now, of course, if that doesn't address some of the things that they need, maybe it's outdoor performance, being able to climb over certain obstacles, getting into a van, then that's when I would start to explore the front wheel drive option from us called the Forefront 2 and the rear wheel drive option, which is called the Quantum Rival. Depending on what you need, they're going to do different things. And that's kind of what the presentation really, hopefully, is helping to address. The front wheel drive and the rear wheel drive, both though, are going to do a much better job of getting over top of obstacles, period. The second one was that the bariatric client, or no, the active
no, say
user.
an active adult who takes a SkyTrain into work.
Okay, the active adult. So again, I still would start with a mid-wheel drive. In this case, it might be a Q4. If it's a smaller adult, I might use a Strato. But do be mindful that because of that smaller battery capacity in a lot of mid-wheel drives that you see throughout the industry, sometimes the rear wheel drive and the front wheel drive will be able to put in those bigger batteries, which allow you to get a little bit more range. That active adult needs more range. I mean, that's exactly what we're describing here, right? The active adult might need to go 10, 11, 12 kilometers, and that extra range can be very, very helpful. Again, with the active user as well, they might need a little bit more access, and that's where the front wheel drive and the rear wheel drive might work really, really well for them. And then the last one, bariatric. Okay, so we have two bariatric chairs, and I think this part is a little bit unique for us that we are the only ones that I know of with a 600-pound weight capacity chair. But I want to describe two of them because I didn't do a good job describing bariatric chairs in this presentation. I wanted to steer a little bit away from it. We have one mid-wheel drive offering, which is called the Q6 Edge HD. It's a great place to start. The Q6 Edge HD, although is a mid-wheel drive, much like all the other Edge products that I was showing you in the presentation, but it has a 450-pound weight capacity. It's much like the ones that we have in the presentation, but it uses a much stiffer spring and a much torquier motor gearbox combination. But unlike the chairs that you saw in the presentation, it's wide. It needs to be a little bit wider because the client is wider themselves. We want the chair to be very stable. So the Q6 Edge HD is actually 26 inches in overall width. Again, there's a real need for that wider chair to make it stable. Now, let's add on to that example, and let's pretend instead of being, say, 260 pounds, let's say they are 390 pounds. Or actually, let's even go a little bit higher. Let's say they're 460 pounds. A very heavy client. There's two different ways these bariatric clients are going to present. A lot of times it's going to be more that Android Apple where they carry their weight very forward, or it's going to be more that gynoid pair anthropometry where they carry their weight backward. But in both situations, they actually need to sit, their center of mass ends up being forward on the chair, even where the client is carrying more weight backward. Why that is your seating system will always push the client more forward on the chair. Now, in those cases, I love front wheel drives. Because of that, because of where that center of mass is, it ends up being much closer to the drive wheel. And we're putting so much pressure on that drive wheel, which is a good thing. And it allows us to get traction to bring us over top of those obstacles. And that chair from us is called the Q1450, and it has a 600-pound weight capacity. Does that kind of answer your question, Phil?
Yeah, no, that's a good applying the stuff that we talked about earlier today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm watching for any chats or hands up, and I'm not seeing any at this point. So unless there's additional questions, we'll wrap up and say thanks very much, Sydney, for that presentation. I will, as we discussed earlier, I'll post this on the website, and I think I'll send a note out to all the prescribers and dealers just to let them know that it's there in case somebody wants to go and have a look.
Yeah, that's awesome. And again, thank you, everybody. I again really appreciate everybody's time. It's it's always fun doing these webinars. It gets me out of the gets me out of the doldrum of just doing emails and doing reports. So I really appreciate everybody's time.
Okay. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.
All right, thanks everybody.